is Sarah, and I often wonder how I ended up in the life that I lived for so long, trapped between fear and silence, caged by the shadow of a man who once swore to love me, but who instead became the very reason my heart learned to live in terror, because Daniel, my husband, was not always the monster people later came to know. In the early days, he was charming, attentive, the kind of man who could walk into a room and make people laugh. And I, young and naive, believed I had found a person who would protect me, cherish me, and build a future with me. But what I didn't see then was the darkness hiding beneath his smile, the weakness of his spirit that leaned too heavily on alcohol, the temper that grew sharper with each glass, and the cruelty that only surfaced when the doors were shut and the world couldn't see. At first, the drinking seemed harmless, just a way for him to relax after work, a beer here, a shot there, the smell on his breath something I brushed aside as ordinary. But slowly those bottles became a part of our evenings. The clinking of glass a prelude to storms I would soon come to dread, because the more he drank, the shorter his fuse became, and the smallest things dinner not hot enough, the children making noise, a shirt not ironed the way he wanted were enough to spark an explosion of shouting, fists slamming on tables, insults spat through clenched teeth, and eventually his hands striking me as if I were nothing more than an object to release his frustration upon. I remember the first time he hit me. It was like the ground had been pulled out from under my feet. A shock that left my cheek burning, but my heart hurting even more. Because I told myself it was just once. That maybe I had pushed him. That maybe, if I stayed quiet and careful, it would never happen again. But deep down I knew better. And sure enough, once the line had been crossed, it became easier for him to cross it again and again, until my nights were filled with bruises and my mornings with excuses. I told neighbors I had fallen, told friends I was clumsy, wore makeup thicker than I liked just to hide the truth. And each time I lied, I felt myself shrinking a little more. Until I wasn't Sarah anymore, but just a hollow shell trying to keep peace in a war zone. Our children, two innocent souls, grew up watching shadows play across their mother's face. Shadows of fear, shadows of tears, and though I tried to shield them, I could see in their eyes that they knew more than I wanted them to. That they understood their father's anger in ways children should never have to understand. At night, they would huddle together in their room, covering their ears with small hands to drown out the sound of shouting, the crashes of broken plates, the muffled sobs that escaped from me no matter how hard I tried to swallow them down. Each day I told myself to endure for their sake, that if I stayed maybe I could protect them. Maybe my suffering would be enough to keep his hands away from them. But I was wrong. Because the cruelty of a man like Daniel does not stop at one victim, it seeps into everything, poisoning the air of the home until no one can breathe. I lost count of the nights I sat at the edge of my bed after he passed out, my face swollen, my body aching, my heart shattered, whispering to myself that tomorrow I would find a way out, that tomorrow I would be brave enough to choose life over fear. But tomorrow always came with the weight of doubt, with the chains of financial dependence, with the terror of not knowing what he would do if I dared to leave. The breaking point came one night when he staggered in later than usual. The smell of alcohol mixed with something darker, maybe rage from a fight at the bar, and he unleashed it all on me, his fists harder, his voice louder, my body thrown against the wall while my children screamed from their room, begging him to stop. And in that moment, as I tasted blood on my lips and saw the horror etched on their faces, something inside me snapped. Not in fear, but in resolve. Because I realized if I stayed, I would not survive, and worse, I would raise my children in the image of his violence. teaching them through my silence that abuse is something you endure instead of fight against. And I would not, let that be their story. The very next morning, before he even woke, I took the children by the hand and walked into the courthouse, my legs trembling, my voice shaking, but my heart beating with a determination it had not known before. And I filed for divorce, telling the judge everything, the drinking, the violence, the fear, my desire for nothing more than freedom and safety for me and my children. And though I expected the system to fail me, expected to be told to wait, to reconsider, to compromise, instead I was met with understanding, with papers signed that granted me custody of my children and a chance to start again. For the first time in years, I breathed, really breathed, air that wasn't heavy with dread. And I looked at my children and saw hope flicker in their eyes, fragile but real. But even as I stood in that courtroom, clutching the documents that symbolized my escape, I felt his gaze on me, burning with hatred, and when he leaned forward and whispered, "You'll regret this," I knew my nightmare wasn't over. It had only changed shape, because Daniel was not the kind of man to let go quietly, and his revenge was only just beginning. In the days following the divorce, I tried to believe that life would finally settle into something resembling peace, that the storm had passed and now I could rebuild. But Daniel was a storm that refused to move on, lingering on the horizon, with dark clouds that threatened to swallow any light I managed to find. And it began subtly at first. Little things that might have seemed like coincidence to anyone else, but which I knew carried his fingerprints, because Daniel had always been meticulous in his cruelty. A flat tire one morning when I needed to take the children to school. An anonymous phone call late at night that ended in silence. The sudden disappearance of groceries I had just bought left on the porch when I stepped inside to answer the phone. All of it seemed small in isolation, but together it was a pattern, a reminder that he was still watching, still reaching into our lives no matter how far I tried to run. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself not to give him power by reacting. But the children saw my unease, and they too began to jump at shadows, to flinch when the phone rang, to ask if Daddy was coming back. And though I reassured them with lies about safety and protection, deep down I knew that Daniel was only biding his time, waiting for the moment when his revenge would strike hardest. That moment came one evening when I returned home from work, exhausted but hopeful because I had just received a small promotion. That meant a little more financial stability. And I found the front door ajar, the lock broken, the inside of the house turned upside down as if a hurricane had blown through. But nothing of real value was missing except for a picture frame from the living room. A photo of me holding our two children at the park. Our smiles bright, our faces happy, one of the few memories untouched by his shadow. And seeing that empty spot on the wall filled me with more dread than if he had taken everything. Because it wasn't theft, it was a message. A claim that even in freedom, he still owned pieces of me. I went to the police, of course, showed them the damage, filed the report. But they looked at me with tired eyes, asked if I had proof it was him. And when I said no, they nodded with sympathy, but offered nothing concrete. Just another case file, among many. And I left the station feeling more alone than ever. After that, Daniel escalated. He began showing up at the edges of my life. Not close enough to break the law, but close enough to break me. Standing across the street when I dropped the children at school. Parked two cars behind me at the grocery store, his face appearing in the corner of my vision when I walked home from work. Always there, always watching. And though I tried to stay strong, the constant pressure wore me down until every moment was consumed by fear, every night sleepless, with the anticipation of what he might do next. The children, too, began to suffer, their grades slipping, their laughter fading. nightmares waking them at odd hours. And I knew this was his revenge, not just on me but on them. Because Daniel understood the deepest wound he could inflict on me was through the suffering of our children. The breaking point came when one evening, after a long day, I walked into the kitchen to find a note pinned to the fridge with a knife. The handwriting unmistakably his, scrawled with rage. You can't hide them from me forever. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the phone when I called the police. But again, without proof, without a witness, they could do little more than send a patrol car to circle the block a few times before moving on. And I realized then that if I wanted to survive, if I wanted my children to have any chance at peace, I would have to find a way to fight back, not with fists or threats, but with the kind of strength Daniel had never expected from me, the kind of strength that grows in silence until it becomes unbreakable. I began documenting everything, every phone call, every shadow, every strange sound at night. I kept a journal, took photographs, saved voicemails, building a case not just for the law but for myself, proof that I wasn't crazy, that the terror we lived with was real. And with each entry, each small act of defiance, I felt the first sparks of control returning to me, faint but enough to keep me from drowning. Meanwhile, Daniel's tactics grew bolder. He tried to turn the children against me, telling them during rare supervised visits that I had stolen them away from him, that I was the reason our family was broken. And though they clung to me with trust, I could see the confusion creeping into their young minds, the seeds of doubt he was planting. And it broke my heart to know that even in absence, he found ways to poison what little stability I offered. One night, he set fire to the trash bin outside our house, the flames licking dangerously close to the porch before neighbors helped put it out. And though the fire department called it vandalism, I knew it was him, a warning, a taste of the destruction he promised if I didn't crumble. But instead of breaking me, it solidified something inside me, a core of resolve that whispered I could not keep running, that if I truly wanted to be free, I had to face him, not as a weak, frightened woman he had molded me into, but as the survivor I was becoming, because revenge might have been his game, but survival would be mine. I didn't tell the children everything, of course. They were too young to carry that weight. But I began teaching them small lessons: how to be aware of their surroundings, how to stay calm in emergencies, how to trust their instincts, because I knew that one day, sooner or later, Daniel would try to strike harder. And when that moment came, I wanted us to be ready. I found strength in unexpected places too, in support groups of women who had lived stories like mine. Women whose voices trembled as they spoke, but whose spirits shone with resilience. And in their company, I realized I wasn't alone, that my story was one of many, and that together, we carried a strength Daniel could never touch. But even as I gathered that strength, Daniel's presence loomed larger, his revenge circling closer. Until one night, as I tucked my children into bed, I heard the unmistakable sound of a window shattering downstairs, and my heart leapt into my throat as I realized the storm had finally broken into our home. The sound of the shattering glass froze me in place, my body trembling between instinct and fear. And for a moment I wanted to scoop up the children and run, but some deeper part of me knew there was no running left to do, not anymore. That this was the moment Daniel had been circling toward all along, the collision he wanted between my fear and his power. And I couldn't let him win, not this time. So I whispered to the children to stay in their room, lock the door, and no matter what they heard, not to come out. Then I grabbed the phone in one hand and the small bat I kept hidden behind the door in the other, my heartbeat loud enough to drown out thought as I crept downstairs. And there he was, Daniel, standing in the living room with that crooked grin that had haunted me even in sleep. His clothes disheveled, his eyes glassy with drink, but his presence deliberate, as if he had rehearsed this moment for months, and he laughed when he saw me. A cruel sound that echoed off the broken glass. "You thought you could take them from me, Sarah? You thought you could live without me?" And his words weren't questions, but accusations. Daggers meant to pierce what little armor I had left. But I tightened my grip on the bat, stood my ground though my legs threatened to give way. And I told him in a voice I barely recognized as my own, "It ends tonight, Daniel, one way or another." And for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, as if he hadn't expected defiance, hadn't expected the woman he had broken down to rise up against him. And in that moment, I knew I had already won something, even if the fight wasn't over. He lunged at me then, hands outstretched. An instinct took over. I swung the bat with every ounce of strength I had, the crack echoing through the room as he stumbled back, cursing, rage spilling from him like venom. But I didn't stop, because this was years of pain and fear and silence finding a voice. Every swing of the bat a reclaiming of the self he had stolen, until finally he crumpled to the ground, groaning but still alive. And I dropped the bat, breathless, trembling, but unbroken, grabbing the phone to call the police, my voice shaking as I reported the break-in, the attack, everything I had documented, everything I had endured. And for once, the system listened, the weight of evidence undeniable. The bruises on my arms, the shattered window, the journal of threats all combining into a story too clear to ignore. And Daniel was taken away that night, his shouts echoing from the back of the squad car. But they no longer had power. They no longer belonged to me. The children came out only when the red and blue lights faded, their small faces pale with fear. And I knelt to hold them, whispering that we were safe now, that the worst was behind us. Though I knew healing would take time, that scars do not vanish overnight. But for the first time in years, I believed my own words, because Daniel's revenge had consumed him, not us. And what he had meant as my undoing had instead become the fire that forged my strength. In the weeks that followed, I testified. I told the truth of what had been done. And though the process was grueling, each step felt like a stone laid on the path away from him. And when the sentence finally came, years behind bars, I walked out of that courthouse with my children's hands in mine, the weight on my shoulders lighter than it had ever been, because revenge had not destroyed me. It had transformed me. And now the story I carried was not one of defeat, but of survival. Of a woman who had endured the storm and still stood, scarred but unbroken. And as I looked at my children laughing again, slowly rediscovering their innocence, I knew that Daniel's shadow no longer defined us, that we were free, and that in reclaiming my voice, I had reclaimed our future.